Hello, everyone. On behalf of Concordia, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Concordia Live, bringing together three partners integral to the COVAX Vaccine Facility to talk about how they structured such a partnership and its applications to other pressing global issues. Concordia, as a platform dedicated to promoting public-private partnership and cross-sector collaboration, is pleased to partner with its global patron member Citi on today's discussion and to welcome Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and One Campaign to elevate this example of innovation and cooperation. Today, our goal is to have a conversation unlike anything we could access in the media and to really benefit from the time Jay Collins, Dr. Seth Berkley, and Gayle Smith can share with us. I'm especially thrilled that each of our speakers, whose extensive biographies are available on the SpotMe platform underneath their headshots, is wanting to approach today's conversation as a learning moment and to pull back the curtain as to how this partnership really came together in order to best present it as a model to follow in other global health and development areas. We anticipate this Concordia Live to inspire a lot of programming for Concordia through our Concordia Action Alliance and our upcoming Programming and Partnering 2021 calendar. Before I kick off the conversation, I'd like to share some very brief housekeeping matters. One, our audience, you, are encouraged to use the discussion feed to introduce yourselves and your work in this area, and Concordia is happy to facilitate follow-on introductions for our member community joining us today. This event is being recorded and will be available on our website. Questions are encouraged and will be answered in a follow-up blog post authored by our speakers. So please use that Q&A feature to ask any questions. And because we're short on time for today's discussion, we'll make sure to respond to those in a written format. Without further ado, I will now turn to the reason that we're all gathered here and we can kick this conversation off in earnest. Seth, we'll start with you. We're going to assume our listeners know the basics. So, as CEO of Gavi, could you please tell us what you see as the most pressing issues that COVAX is facing right now to deliver vaccines to countries around the world on an equitable basis? What would you say is your day-to-day challenge set?
So thanks, Hanne, and it's great to be here with all of you. Let me just start with when we realized that this was going to be a global pandemic. The real question was, how do we make sure that everybody who gets vaccines, who need them, get them? And we talked about this issue of vaccine equity. We talked about no one is safe unless everyone is safe. I'm not sure people really believed it at the beginning. But with the new variants now, people have begun to understand now in a global pandemic that if we don't deal with the worldwide spread of disease, we're going to have a problem. So I think that's really the first big problem we have is how to get that global consensus. Because the normal way people think about things is my community, my family, my country, my whatever. And in this case, you need to think about both, even if it's only for self-interest. And that's a really important point for us. So that, I think, is one of the big challenges that we've had. We've been able to procure doses and get that going. But of course, the speed at which this is being rolled out is challenging. We've already rolled out about 30 million doses to 60 countries, which is important. We had to make sure countries were prepared, ready, had the funding available. The scale of delivery, of course, is going to be enormous here, that we had the infrastructure in place, new technology, and this is where engagement with the private sector is really critical. How do we track and trace both vaccines as well as people? And then how do we overcome this vaccine nationalism, which is competing with the work that we're trying to do to have this fair and equitable access? But I have to say, this is the largest multilateral new effort since the Paris Climate Accord. And so I think the challenge is bringing everybody along with us to help solve these problems.
Thanks, Seth. And to pick up on that multilateral note and the importance of different sectors playing a leadership role in this space unlike ever before, let's turn to Jay. As Citi is the financial and risk advisor to Gavi and COVAX, and you are the team lead and senior advisor for this assignment and thus mired in all that risk figuration, can you give us a snapshot of some of the things you're thinking through in achieving the COVAX mission and how you're working to mitigate or manage those risks on behalf of Citi and COVAX?
Fantastic. Well, first of all, that's quite a question. Let me see if I can boil that down. I'd start with what you said, which was partnership, because it's been an extraordinary 6-month partnership with Gavi and the team between Citi. We've had 29 bankers dedicated to this process to look at pretty much every aspect of financial and risk matters. And what's extraordinary in it is just this process of identifying virtually any risk that Gavi could face in this transition from really an agent role in its long history to a principal role, where it's taking risk not only in new dimensions, but it's taking at a speed and degree of complexity that required really doubling down in identifying, sizing, and then importantly, in the partnership with Seth, has been putting mitigation strategies against them. And I say strategies because as Seth and I have seen, we've had plan A, but we've also had to have plan B and plan C to make sure that everything is absolutely mitigated and in a material way, and that we can't fail and we won't fail. So to give the audience that comfort that whether it's sovereign credit risk, whether it's extraordinary efforts with Linklaters in contract management, the idea that that Gavi and the COVAX facility actually makes firm order commitments with the manufacturers on behalf of the countries, we need to know that we mitigate in every way the ability to then have those vaccines be purchased by those countries. So whether it's external public or private insurers that insure that, whether it's the analysis and the work on the financing with the donors, whether it's liquidity issues or just even block and tackle operational and FX issues, we've sized and looked at everything and put a strategy behind it. And what is extraordinary is the complexity has been managed with the number of participants at the table at a pretty fantastic speed. So I'll stop there.
We thank you for that, Jay and Citi.
You're right, Jay. I gave you a lot to try to address in that question. So apologies, but you gave us a lot to work with there. So thinking through how this partnership truly requires coordination at the financial level, the operational level, the political and diplomatic levels, and then the more local levels, of course. I think you mentioned the flexibility that's required as any of these elements go a bit awry. And I think that that's so important to think through when structuring a partnership. So Gayle, let's talk a little bit about that cross-sector collaboration and how in your experience and with your organization, how you might see that collaboration as it pertains to COVAX and the level of which that coordination was required, and what kind of adjustments or learnings do you have that could be necessary to continue this collaboration moving forward?
Thanks. It's a great question, and thanks so much for having me. I've worked with Gavi for a long time, and I think if you think about what it gives us a foundation on vaccine coverage in countries that are less able to access the market or afford vaccines, on a host of vaccines, including now COVID. And it gives us the potential to achieve scale, which is important from a humanitarian point of view, but also from a global public health point of view. I think this coalition came together very well. I think there are a couple of features that are key. It's very much a coalition of the willing. And its urgency was particular during the first year of this pandemic, because the world, frankly, did not come together in the ways it typically does when there's a global crisis. So the fact that this public-private partnership, all these actors came together to say we need to build something, was stupendous and urgent. Now, I think if we want to talk about how do you sustain it and how do you build it over time, I think there are a few things. There are a number of governments who are very supportive of COVAX. It does not yet have the funding it needs to achieve the goals we've set. And it's a great thing to laud something as really effective. It's a better thing to put your money where your mouth is. So I think investments need to be consistent, predictable, and more regular. I think the second is on the market side. One of the interesting things being done through COVAX is, as was just described, the way COVAX is entering a market, which is usually dominated by other countries. And it's a great model. It's an innovative model. It's one we need in the global health area. But I think we've seen a couple things that I hope we will take out of this experience and use to build on the COVAX model going forward. One is more transparency in the market. COVAX is out there competing, and let's be plain, this is not as transparent a market as needs to be. Second is pricing in the market, and the third is how we really think about distribution. It would be my hope, and I'm the eternal optimist and a very determined human being, that we can take the lessons from this to say, look at what COVAX has done and what it's able to do. If we want to maximize its impact, how do we learn from its experience with the market to make the changes we need to make it more effective? Although I do hope we don't need it again anytime soon.
The world needs determined optimists. Jay, in thinking through actually, Seth, let's go to you on this one. In thinking through the variance you mentioned, and then in pairing it with Gayle's hope that this type of urgency is not required again, let's talk about some of the threat from variants and how they are, what that looks like for how Gavi, how the COVAX facility is thinking through next steps to perhaps deliver beyond what was originally envisioned or imagined.
Well, first of all, as much as I love Gayle, I am sorry to say that it is evolutionarily certain there will be more outbreaks. The question is how prepared we are for them. And of course, I do hope that they don't come right on the heels. On the other hand, we're dealing with 2 Ebola outbreaks right now in the middle of this. So I think what has been the problem has been the world has not really planned and put the efforts into being there for pandemics, which of course, are some of the worst threats to our economy, to our well-being. And I think that's the key lesson we have to do is in peacetime, if I want to use that term, we have to continue to focus on these issues. But getting back to the variant question, we have to remember we are 4 months into the era of vaccines now. And the first thing on the variants is we need better surveillance. I mean, we have places like the UK where they're sequencing all the time and they have a good knowledge. And then we have large areas of continents where we have very little information on what's happening. And that's a threat to those countries, to those continents, but it's a threat to the world because we need to be able to track that. What do we know so far? Well, we know that they've become more transmissible, and we also know that some of the interventions have been less effective, some not effective at all, some of the antibody treatments. But the good news so far is the vaccines seem to continue to protect against severe disease, which is the critical component for them. But we need to be prepared for what to do in the future. So we don't know how long these vaccines last for. And we don't yet fully understand the epidemiology. So, for example, do we need to ultimately vaccinate children? We don't have vaccines yet for children. But one of the things that has to be worked on now is being able to answer the question, should we, after we cover the high-risk groups, which is about 20% in countries, do we linearly keep vaccinating to high levels? Do we need to go back and vaccinate those high-risk people again because the vaccines aren't, sustaining their immunity, or because they're having they need new vaccines against the variants? Or do we need to change and have vaccinations on a regular basis that are either adjusted for variants or are supplementing with variant vaccines? So there's a lot of scientific questions there, which is why what we have to do now is get the baseline coverage as soon as possible, because the more vaccines you have, the less variants, the less risk. But then we're going to need to follow the science to decide what the interventions are going to be going forward.
Thank you. Science is always a driver of innovation. So Jay, from Citi's perspective, what are the most innovative components of what COVAX is doing? And are those innovations potentially relevant to the world beyond the current COVID-19 crisis?
Yes, so absolutely. So Seth and I have talked about this. We could write a book on the innovation associated with this, if not at least a detailed case study, because it is pretty extraordinary. And just to add to what Seth just said on the variants we've talked about, it really is fundamentally about more doses from a risk perspective and being just prepared to have more doses pushed to the world. But in terms of this innovation, if you look at the scale of the collaborative, cooperative mechanisms between regulators and policymakers, between the private sector manufacturers, between countries that are donors and recipients, This hasn't been done on this scale, not just as a policy matter, but as an execution matter, other than in times of war. And so we've established these that will not only be useful to future pandemics, but other situations. We've also established with Seth's leadership this concept of just distribution or equitable and fair distribution of vaccines, that you don't have to have the funding. So being able to bifurcate a country that has the ability to self-fund, self-finance itself versus bucketing countries that need donor monies to be able to purchase vaccines. So those principles are there. And also creativity along a range of specialty areas, whether it's what we've done now with dose sharing principles, which are so important in this dose sharing exchange mechanism. The Quad is a great example of that. And the demands now on the developed world that has drawn supply in to then help us reallocate to the poorer countries. The humanitarian buffer, which Gavi and the COVAX facility have designed to target the humanitarian population. No fault compensation mechanism. Again, that's never been done before on this scale for issues of insurance and liability, to take 92 countries in the world and tell them that the no fault compensation coverage will be provided. But fundamentally, this is about having not just an orchestrator an executor between countries and manufacturers, but the standard bearers, as Seth mentioned, vaccine nationalism, vaccine hesitancy, these kinds of issues. We now have a home for an advocate that's at the table, that's telling these stories, that's telling the world why just equitable, fair distribution is critical. And the last thing I'd say is, obviously in the risk space, I think Gavi and the Citi team are innovating every day in terms of how systemic risks are managed by what is essentially a nonprofit international organization.
Thanks. I think if we could all crack the code on how to design those teams to think creatively and innovatively, right, to the degree that all of your teams are diligently doing right now, it'd be an interesting skill set to kind of universally apply. Gayle, let's turn to you. What can the world do better to support the urgent need to get more supply of vaccines to the poorest countries faster? We've spoken a little bit about the importance, sorry to jump in, but we've spoken a bit about the importance of universal vaccination. So can you speak about why that speed is so important as well?
Yeah, I sure can. And I want to underscore the use of the word systemic. And I think part of the beauty of what we've got here is it's a systemic approach. And to the last point, part of what fuels innovation is just being bold and saying, what's the problem and why not? And I think we've seen a lot of that in this case. But I think what the world really needs to do to think about speed is think about it like this. And I learned this during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa that Seth and I went through together. If the virus is moving faster than we are, it's winning. Right now, it's moving faster than we are. We're seeing the evidence all the time that the longer and more space it has to replicate, the more likely it will mutate and we'll see variants. So the question before us is, do we want to stop this, say, by the end of 2022 or a bit later than that, shorten the lifespan of the pandemic? Or do we want to stretch this out for a few years? Because those are the real choices. What the science and the epidemiology tell us is that because it's a global pandemic, we need to move systematically and globally. What we're doing right now is working sequentially. Countries are thinking in a linear fashion. And I understand why. I could not be more thrilled that President Biden has gotten our vaccination system on track as an American citizen. I am thrilled. But I also understand that if the world thinks, let's do these 10 countries and then let's do these 20 countries and these 30, we're stretching out the length of time. So it turns out that vaccine access is equitable and fair. It's also really smart because that's the thing that will shorten the lifespan of the pandemic. And I think part of what we've got to do is help educate about that message because some people don't hear it. It's a very fair question to say, why should we be sharing vaccines or giving more money for other countries There is a values-based answer to that, which is very key to me and to many of us. There's an economic self-interest argument to that, if you look at the economic impact of the pandemic. And there's a global public health argument. We can shorten the lifespan of this pandemic if we move on multiple tracks at once. And that's the single biggest thing I think we need to do, is shift that mindset. Great to do what you need to do at home, but we've all got to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Those information campaigns are so crucial. So we have a few moments left, and with that remaining time, I'd like to pose a question to all of our speakers to address. We'll start with Seth, go with Jay, and then finish up with Gayle. That's the order on my screen. So in the final moments, can you please give us a prediction on how other global issues, health crisis or otherwise, could benefit from the type of model that's being demonstrated by the Citi Gavi COVAX facility? And from each of your perspectives, how would you like to see other challenges learned from this moment, applying and adapting this model of public-private partnership and intensely coordinated global leadership? Seth?
So thanks. Of course, that's a hard question, but starting with the fact that there was already a partnership. So Gavi is the alliance. It's not an institution. It was already working with WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, civil society, vaccine manufacturers. We've expanded by bringing in CEPI and other groups like Citibank and others to help us. But I think what's important is that network model versus an institutional model gives you an incredible amount of flexibility, because you can scale up, scale out, bring different expertise in as you need to. And I think that's important. This type of collaboration is absolutely critical, because we want to end the epidemic or the pandemic, as we heard from Gayle. So I think getting this voice out that this is a global problem and a global solution is critical. It's going to be critical for other things. Can we learn lessons here, for example, what we're going to need to do around climate change? But the other issue that's critical is this isn't, people think of this as a health issue or it's a development issue. It's not. This is, unlike a traditional security threat, an infectious disease can't be solved through sanctions or military postings, deterrence, or bilateral diplomacy, but it has to be this type of global scientific collaboration, long-term investments in global health and resilient health systems, and through smart and strategic multilateralism. And so I think for us, it's learning from history and not repeating it. We're doing much better now than we did the last H1N1 in terms of statistics, even though we're not at where we want to be. But how do we then keep that global solidarity and collaboration going forward? And those partnerships, I believe today, is what will help us in the future in that, as I said, inevitability of more outbreaks, but in preparing countries to be able to deal with them.
Thanks, Seth. Jay?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Gayle for that point on variants, because I do think that the COVAX approach is the best tool against variants and mutations, and that people should, yes, adopt what you said. We all believe in the equitable distribution, but rolling out vaccines to the world is critical to and perhaps our best tool in slowing the variant and potential mutation of the virus. In terms of, I just want to just say that what Seth said in terms of climate change, I think is a perfect example. I spent a lot of time at Citi working on sustainability, and if we look at what's happening in energy transition, let's think about that, right? With climate change, we will have many of the same issues, right? Which is scaled global public-private partnerships coming together, massive investments with technology that can be borne by some, but that have to be thought about in terms of the amortization of it. And the regulatory and policy coordination is just one part of it, but just distribution. People talk about just energy transition. Well, these principles of who shares the burden in terms of the cost of what climate change will really entail, how will it be distributed? Poorer countries that may be more brown in nature, wealthy countries that can help them accelerate their energy transition. A lot of the concepts that Gavi and COVAX have put in face, not just in terms of coordination and collaboration, but in how we think allocating resources, allocating fund, allocating risk, are actually simply just laying the groundwork for some of the choices that we will, as a globe, face over time in the climate change space.
Too true. And Gayle?
I think, look, there's so many places that this model would be hugely impactful.
Pick your SDG.
I think about that nexus between the agricultural economy that the majority of the world's low-income countries depend on, rising food insecurity, and the climate crisis. And one of the things that this alliance does, as Seth pointed out, is it allows for flexibility, but also allows for scale. And one of the places where the world is not succeeding is in achieving scale. We've got some great wins, some great reductions in poverty, some wins in global public health, separate and apart from this pandemic. But we're not yet at the point where we're really getting the scale we need. That is the difference between improving people's lives and actual transformation, right? And I think in that sector, if you think of the tools that are brought together, the public and the private sector, huge and important partners. I think, again, this working with markets. I've spent a long time in my career looking at advanced market commitments, other mechanisms that can be used to stimulate and access a market that, quite frankly, wasn't designed to deal with the kinds of challenges we're dealing with, but can be adapted. So I think that's a really, really vital role. And then the third and last thing I would say is that it's the results. I would speculate that, when Gavi was started, there were some skeptics. I know from during the Ebola epidemic that there were some people saying, oh yeah, right, sure, this is going to happen. And I think that partnerships like Gavi, which is the institutional alliance base for COVAX, have stories to tell about real, tangible, measurable results. And we need those to make the case to people that we need to make more investments like this and build and strengthen these institutions over time.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the three of you for answering that question, but everything that we've talked through today. Again, I'll encourage our audience to submit any future questions that were kind of opened up through the course of today's discussion. Send them via the chat, the Q&A feature on the SpotMe platform, or to a Concordia team member, and we'll make sure that we can address those. I, for one, would love to know how Citi was able to get this no-fault compensation coverage expanded at that scale, because it seems like it was a really innovative financial lever that was applied here. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to each of our speakers. Not just for sharing with us the work that they're doing today and the way that they're thinking through this and other global challenges, but for the work of their institutions in all of this, in helping us as a global community access the medical vaccinations, the information, the resources we all need, and then thinking through the longer term effects of economic and equitable economic recovery. So with that, we will close it up and encourage everyone to submit their questions, to rewatch the video when it's made live on our website, and to, of course, share the messages that Jay, Seth, and Gayle all brought forth. Have a great day, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.